Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're heading over to Baltimore, Maryland.
Baltimore. Always something interesting happening there.
Right. We're going to untangle a story about housing, history, and some pretty serious allegations of discrimination.
This is going to be good. Lay it on me.
So, at the center of all this, we have a man named Nicholas Miles.
Okay.
He was a homeowner in a revitalization project called Station East.
Station East. Got it. Revitalization, you say.
And this is what makes it so interesting. We're lucky enough to be working with actual legal documents straight from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD.
Oh, wow. Those HUD documents can be gold mines. So what's the dirt? What HUD have to say about all this?
Well, it all revolves around a complaint this Mr. Miles filed against the developers of Station East.
Sounds like a classic case of someone being denied housing. I bet we've got some Fair Housing Act stuff brewing here.
You might think so, but it gets a little more complicated.
Yeah.
Mr. Miles had already moved into his home when the dispute started.
Really? Okay, so not denied housing then. This is about something after he moved in. Interesting. So what was the issue then?
It all comes down to a fascinating clash between trying to preserve old buildings and creating affordable housing. See, Station East, they weren't building anything new. They were rehabbing these old buildings. Which brings us to the Maryland Historic Tax Credit, the MHTC. Familiar with that?
You know, I have to admit, I haven't gotten deep into the weeds on that one. Refresh my memory on how that all works again.
So basically, it's meant to encourage developers to fix up these historic buildings. Gives them some tax breaks for doing the renovations. Win-win, right?
No.
Historic buildings get saved, and we get more affordable housing.
Sounds good in theory, but I know there's always a catch. What's the fine print this time?
Well, homeowners who benefit from the renovations have to agree to send a chunk of those tax credit funds back to the developers.
Ah, I see. Keeps the lights on for everyone, so to speak. Gotcha.
Exactly. Okay, so that leads us to the heart of Mr. Miles's complaint.
Let's hear it.
He claimed he was being singled out, sued by these developers to fork over the MHTC money.
Wow, okay.
And he said other homeowners, white homeowners, weren't being held to the same standard. Oh, and it gets worse. He claimed they were intentionally delaying repairs on his house to pressure him into paying.
Whoa. So he's saying they were like, you want that leaky faucet fixed, cough up the cash.
Basically. Naturally, HUD launched an investigation. This is where things get really interesting. We really need to break down what these HUD documents tell us.
Get me.
Okay, so the developers, in their response, said that this agreement, sending over the tax credit money, totally standard, everyone signs it, just part of the deal.
Two very different stories here. So what did HUD say after looking into all this? Who was telling the truth?
Well, HUD ultimately said there was no reasonable cause to back up Mr. Miles' claims of discrimination.
No reasonable cause. That's kind of a head-scratcher. What does that even mean, legally speaking? Are they saying he made it all up?
It's a great question, and it trips a lot of people up. No reasonable cause, legally, just means that HUD couldn't find enough evidence to prove the developers intentionally discriminated based on race.
Interesting.
It's really important to understand. This doesn't mean Mr. Miles was wrong or nothing bad happened. It just means that, legally speaking, under the Fair Housing Act, HUD didn't have that smoking gun to prove discrimination.
So what were they looking at to make this decision? Did they find anything to support the developer side?
They did. One thing they considered was the racial makeup of the Station East development. They found it was actually very diverse.
Okay, diverse community. Makes sense.
And they couldn't find evidence that other homeowners were let off the hook with the MHTC agreement. This is a legal investigation, so they need proof, not just someone saying, well, I heard this.
Right. Hard evidence. Gotcha. What about the repairs? Did HUD address those delays Mr. Miles was talking about?
They did. The report acknowledges his concerns about the delays, but they also pointed out that, based on the information they had, it seemed like the developers were trying to fix them. They even went so far as to extend his home warranty.
Interesting. So at least on paper, it seems like they were making an effort.
Right. And it's important to point out that even though HUD said no reasonable cause, it didn't close the door on Mr. Miles taking legal action.
Oh, really? He could still sue.
Absolutely. HUD made it very clear that he was still within his rights to file a lawsuit if he wanted to.
Okay, so even with the no reasonable cause, it wasn't necessarily over for him.
Not at all. So where does this leave us? We have a homeowner who feels like he was treated unfairly, potentially because of his race, as part of this big project. HUD investigates but can't definitively prove those claims under the Fair Housing Act. But, and this is important, it doesn't erase what happened or how the homeowner felt.
Right, right. This is where things get really interesting for our listeners. It's easy to get caught up in the legal back and forth, but when you dig deeper, it just exposes all these layers of complexity you see in urban development, especially when you're dealing with race and economic disparities.
Absolutely. And, it highlights this issue of even when you have these big projects, often seen as good for the community, they can sometimes clash with the experiences of the people they're supposed to help.
It's like trying to force a square peg into a round hole sometimes.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And this really drives home how important transparency is and clear communication right from the start, especially when you've got these complicated financial agreements like those tied to these tax credits. It's easy to get lost in the weeds, even if you know the law.
Absolutely. I mean, let's be honest. Who here has actually sat down and read through all those tax credit documents? It's not exactly light reading.
No, not at all. And when you factor in the history of housing discrimination, especially in a place like Baltimore, it's no wonder people are suspicious, even if discrimination wasn't the main issue here.
It reminds you that we all carry our own histories and experiences, right? Mr. Miles's experience, regardless of HUD's findings, really shows us how important it is to remember that historical and social context.
Exactly. Stories like his are so important, even when there's no simple legal answer. They force us to face the realities, the human side of things, that can get lost in all the paperwork.
It's easy to forget that these aren't just legal cases, right? These are real people with families trying to build lives.
And their stories deserve to be heard. Their experiences matter, and they're a big part of this whole picture of urban revitalization.
So from your perspective, what can we do to prevent this from happening again? How can we make sure these revitalization efforts are fair and really benefit everyone? How do we make sure people don't have to go through what Mr. Miles did?
That's the million-dollar question. And there's no easy answer, but I think it starts with really engaging the community. And I mean throughout the entire process, not just at the beginning. It has to be a real conversation.
So not just checking a box, but really listening to the residents, making sure they're part of the decision-making process.
Exactly. They need a seat at the table. And it's crucial that they have clear, easy to understand information about their rights and what they're agreeing to. Especially with these complicated financial agreements, how can they stick up for themselves if they don't even understand the rules?
It's about empowering people,
Right. Yeah.
giving them the knowledge to navigate all of this.
Yes. And building trust. That means the developers and the government need to be open and honest. Everyone needs to feel like the process is fair and that someone's looking out for their interests.
It's a two-way street then.
Without a doubt. And it's a long road. These problems are deep-rooted, and it will take time and effort from everyone to make things truly equitable.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening. It's not just about buildings, it's about people's lives. It's about understanding that progress is about more than just construction. It's about people.
And we have to remember, progress isn't always straightforward.
Right, there are going to be roadblocks, disagreements, and sometimes things happen that no one intended.
It's about learning from those bumps in the road. It's about really listening to the people who feel like they're not being heard.
And trying to do better next time.
Exactly. We need to close that gap between what's written in policy and what people are actually experiencing so everyone feels seen, heard, respected.
Because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, right?
What's that?
Communities where everyone feels safe and welcome and has the opportunity to build a good life.
Well said. This whole deep dive into Mr. Miles's story and this Station East project, it's been really thought-provoking, to say the least.
It really shows you that even when we're talking about housing, urban development, things that seem pretty black and white, there's always more to the story.
Always. There are people behind all those legal papers and policy decisions.
And it reminds us that we need to be thoughtful, listen to each other, and try to see things from other people's points of view. That's how we create communities that are truly fair and inclusive.
Because everyone deserves a decent place to live and a community where they can flourish. Mr. Miles' story, it's just one of many. It reminds us that the fight for fair housing isn't over, and we all have a part to play in building a better future for everyone.
Couldn't agree more. This conversation started here, but it definitely doesn't end here. We want to hear from you, our listeners. What do you think about balancing historical preservation with affordable housing? How can we make sure these projects are fair and benefit everyone?
Join the conversation. Share your thoughts with us on our social media.
And until next time, keep diving deep.